Are you wondering whether your first home will actually make a good investment? In today's episode, we're unpacking the property investment fundamentals every first-time buyer needs to understand, whether you're buying to live in it or to rent-vest. Welcome to your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to feel confident, smart and totally in control of their property journey.
I'm Veronica and that was Meighan, and yes, we're probably old enough to be your mums, which is a good thing because between us we've got decades of experience and we've got your back every step of the way. Our mission, to cut through the BS, keep it real and make sure you're buying smarter, not stressing harder.
Quick heads up. We've created the First Home Buyer course, our step-by-step program to help you buy your first place with confidence and without the costly mistakes. The link's in the show notes, but stick with us first. You'll want to hear this episode.
Today we're talking about property investment fundamentals that every first home buyer should know, regardless of whether it's an investment or a home. In other words, how to think like an investor, even if you're buying your first home to live in. And this is a small part of a couple of steps in our PACE system. So the PACE system, for a refresher, is preparation, action, commitment, execution. And under those four headings are 10 steps. And if you get that all in the right order, your home buying process is going to be a hell of a lot smoother and easier. So we are dabbling with a little bit of step 3, which is planning, and step 4, and also step 7, which is evaluating. So this sort of has tentacled into 3 different steps, but this is a very small part of all of those steps. And so it's complicated, right? There's a lot to know, a lot involved. The course that we teach is the First Home Buyer course, gets it all in the right order, whereas this podcast is traversing lots of different steps at the same time, which won't help you. This is good information, obviously, but you do need to learn the right order. So let's not get too bogged down that right now.
All right. Importantly, Veronica, you want to think like an investor from day one. And even if this is your forever home, it's still one of the biggest financial decisions you'll ever make. So it's important to treat it like an investment. It's an asset. When you look at your assets and liabilities in the future, this sits on the asset side of the ledger. Your loan, of course, sits on the other side, but it is still an asset. You want it to perform as well as you possibly can whilst also meeting your personal needs. So a well-chosen first property will actually set you up for your financial future. If it's a stepping stone, it'll actually help you upgrade. It might be used to invest. You might leverage it to invest or to refinance with a lot less stress in the future.
And I think this is really important because you will hear people saying, look, it doesn't matter if it's your home. It doesn't matter whether it is or isn't a good investment. But the simple fact is it is most people's biggest single asset. As Meighan was saying, it is an asset. And therefore, it gives you opportunities to do other things. And also, it's unlikely your first home is going to be forever home. So you want the maximum flexibility that is afforded you by buying a good investment as a home. So that's why we want to teach you these principles. So the second principle here, thinking like an investor from the outset is very important. But there is a difference. You might be hearing the words investor grade properties or investment stock. Now, this is an interesting one, particularly for people who are looking at buying off the plan, buying a newish apartment even, or buying a house and land package. Because not all investment properties are created equal. A lot of off the plan apartments, dual key dwellings, high density units, they might look shiny, but they rarely deliver on the investment side of things. Like they rarely deliver long-term growth. And so that's what we call investor stock. They're built for investors, but really smart investors don't buy them. Sadly, people who do buy them aren't necessarily smart investors and they don't usually get great returns on their investments, which is terrible.
It is a shame because some of these people are actually very intelligent individuals but haven't learnt what are the key drivers or the potential for capital growth in a property. So they kind of get caught up in the spin, in the excitement, in the shininess of some of these projects.
Well, yeah. I mean, the thing too is that you've got to have a certain income to be able to afford to invest in property. So you can't be too much of a slouch in your day job. But the problem is a lot of people just don't spend the time or they're not even interested in learning about property and investment principles. And it's really important because you get it wrong, cost yourself hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of dollars, right, over time. So investment grade properties, very different to investment stock. On the other hand, these appeal to people who actually want to live there, right? So they've got a bit of character, scarcity, good location, emotional appeal, the very things that owner-occupiers like that drive price growth over time. And so that's a great irony, is that, we say to investors, you have to think like an owner-occupier because they're really the people that push prices up. But owner-occupiers sometimes throw out thinking out the window, which is a bit ironic. But so we encourage owner-occupiers to think like investors and investors to think like owner-occupiers for that reason.
For that reason and for many other reasons. I mean, you've got a set of investment fundamentals that work in your area. We have a set of investment fundamentals that we know works in our area. The investment fundamentals for each area are really quite different. So even when you're thinking like an investor, you've got to make sure that you're thinking like an investor for the area that you're buying in and for the property type that would be appealing to a future owner-occupier in the area that you're looking in. So, there's so much depth. We are covering just not even the tip of the iceberg here.
It's the surface.
We are not even getting, to water level here. We're not even going down, but there's a lot that sits under this. I guess what we want to do is make sure that your eyes are open and you're thinking right at the start. Then you can put all your steps in the right order.
Now, one of the big things, a lot of first-home buyers who are thinking about rent investing and a lot of investors that are not first-home buyers, they get sucked in by yield, right? So what yield is where you've got a high proportion of rent to the purchase price of the property. But in particular, you get a lot of people saying, they really want the rent to pay the mortgage, right? Because that feels safe.
It feels really safe.
It feels like it's not costing you anything and it feels smart. But the problem is that capital growth and yield are often mutually exclusive, and capital growth is the most important thing.
One comes at the cost of the other. Let's, put it that way.
Yeah. So it is tempting to chase high yields or high rents, but that is very much short-term thing because the rent might cover the costs, right? But if you're not getting capital growth, then you're not building wealth. And the building of wealth is what gives you the opportunity to do those future things talking about, to give you the opportunity to upgrade or give you the opportunity to invest or to refinance. If you don't build wealth through capital growth, all you're doing is paying down debt, and you might as well just be renting because you've got a lot less flexibility than a renter does. But you've got none of the benefits really of renting. You've got all the costs of home ownership without any of the benefits of home ownership. So best properties often have lower yields, which means that they are effectively costing in the first few years, often the first 10 years, it costs you money out of your cash flow to own those properties because they're in areas with high demand, and that pushes prices up. But long term, when you go to sell that property or refinance against it, that's what you want. You actually want to buy something where the price has gone up. So when in doubt, really focus on what will be easier to sell later, not just what's cheap to buy now. And we do have a Home Buyer Academy principle, which is if it's easy to buy, it's probably going to be hard to sell. And that's the whole thing we're talking about here. Quite often, properties with high yields are very easy to buy because there's lots of people lured by that higher rental return, but they do become problematic when it comes time to sell, because you find that owner-occupiers aren't interested in them and they haven't grown in value. And anybody who's a smart investor will look at the history of the property and realise that it's not really providing a great return. So you've got to be really careful about that.
You do. And even if you're living in the property, so let's put aside rent vesting as one of the strategies that's possible. But if you're living in the property as a first home buyer, capital growth still matters. And that is because usually, as you said earlier, it's your first home isn't your forever home. So when you want to sell that home or potentially use it as an investment property and leverage the capital growth or the equity that you've got in that first property to buy the next property, you want to make sure that property has kept pace with or outperformed everything else in the area that you want to buy in. And that's the key. Stepping stone strategy only works if you get that asset selection right and that property grows at least as fast or better than where you want to be next. And that's so very important because if you end up with a really big gap between what you've purchased and what you want to purchase, you've got to dip in, you've either have got a much better income or you will have to have found that extra money somewhere else. So capital growth absolutely matters even if you're living in the property, it's your home, and you're expecting to use that property towards something else in the future.
Another really important principle is that land value versus improvement. So basically it's the land value versus the building value. What really builds wealth, right? Well, it's actually the capital growth comes from the land. And I know this is a bit of a hard one to get your head around because you think, well, you can't live on a block of land, you can't live in a tent. Effectively, when you buy a property and you go to rent it out, you can't rent the block of land. Let's face it, there's very few people going to rent a block of land, unless they're farmers, but they will rent a building. So you get rental income from the building, but the capital growth from the land. Now, in Brisbane, I know you look for properties where at least 40% of the values in the land itself.
Minimum from an investment fundamentals point of view, and we have 36 investment fundamentals plus our due diligence checklist that we look at. And land component is one of those. And that's looking at, well, what's the purchase price compared to the rateable land value, not necessarily the market value. We want to have at least 40%, but most of the time we're looking at around 55 to 60% as a percentage. That means that we're putting more focus on the capital growth component than we are on the depreciating asset, which is the building that sits on top.
So to give you an example of where this really matters is if you buy a block of land with a house on it and that house is brand new, then it is depreciating fast. You know, it's getting out of date fast. It's like when you drive a brand new car out of the showroom. Everyone knows you basically lose value the minute you hit the road, right? It's a little bit the same with properties, that once things start to date, once they get used, once they don't look as shiny and new compared to the next subdivision where they've got the newer type of bench tops that are the newest fashion taps and all that sort of stuff. And so these things do depreciate. And at the other end of the spectrum, when you buy an old home, like a period home, which has got beautiful period features, they can appreciate because of scarcity. So it's not a simple rule here, but those established properties tend to be in areas where land is very expensive. Whereas the new subdivisions, the land is a lot cheaper and the house that they're put on it is quite an expensive proportion or a higher proportion. And yet that's what's depreciating. So understanding that inverse proportionality of land and building is really, really important. It's something that we do help with for students in home buyer course because we recognise it's a really complicated concept. But local knowledge is everything as well, because the simple fact is what will work, the land value and land sizes in one area, for example, will vary in terms of their value compared to another area. But it is fundamentally that the land is the thing that is the asset rather than the building on the land.
And it's not even about the size of the land. I was just thinking about an investor that we're working with at the moment in Brisbane, and they started off with that misconception that the larger the land size, the better the potential for capital growth. And so what we had to talk them through, which is a big part of our education process, is why that doesn't ring true. And as I often say, it depends, because a 250 square metre block of land with a good character house on it, with a good layout in good condition in Red Hill, which is walking distance almost to the CBD, is going to be far more valuable, far scarcer than 1,000 square metres out at Mango Hill, where there's more subdividable land that is available and therefore more supply available. And the houses that sit on it are fairly generic and anywhere between 30 and 5 years old. So actually then you start to get that concept, well, hang on, it isn't just about the size of the land. It's actually about the location. It's about the elevation. You know, that same 250 square metre block of land in Red Hill at the bottom of a dip with overland flow, not going to have the same value as the one at the top of the hill that doesn't have any issues with it. So it depends.
I often hear that and people go, oh, but like I've got this really big block, but it's in an area that is very undesirable.
Yes. Or it's really odd shape
metre,
and can't be used particularly well. Yeah.
That block just isn't as valuable as a block. So you've got to understand that.
Yeah. Let's have a look at what actually drives capital growth, Veronica, because I know this is what a lot of people will be thinking. All right, well, you're telling us what not to do. What do we do? Now, just again, skimming the surface, capital growth is about competition, and you've touched on it, I've touched on it. The more buyers who actually want a property like yours, the faster it appreciates, all other things being equal. So you want to ask yourself, when you're looking at a potential property, who'll buy this from me later? It's hard to know now because you don't know what future buyers want. But if you get the fundamentals of it right, and there's a lot of people competing for that property against you in the current market, it's a pretty good sign.
And, you know, there's sometimes too, we talk about properties where there's something wrong with it, but they could be fixed and it can turn it into one of those homes. I mean, that's really where you get the best uplift in terms of capital value. I was only thinking about this the other day, that fundamentally is all that capital growth is. It's not the market moving, it's the fact that property will be desirable in the future. That's what it is, because the entire market can do one thing, but one property can outperform it or it can underperform it. So having an understanding of that, and it's really about buyers who determine capital growth, you know, that's sort of illuminating in terms of it switched the light bulb on for me anyway. One thing to really be thinking about though is that there are a lot of red flags, and sometimes investors They might be thinking, oh, it doesn't matter because I'm not going to live in it. But in reality, it does matter because somebody's going to live in it, and in the future, you want somebody to buy it, right? So if you are living in the property yourself, you might think it doesn't matter about investment value because I love it, but you still, again, got to be thinking about who's my future buyer and are there any red flags that are going to really be a problem, right? So certain properties will struggle to resell in most market conditions. Now, if the market is sizzling hot, then pretty much every property gets competition, even the dogs. Right? That's what you've got to be super careful of if you're in a rising market, is not to inadvertently compete for a dog, right? Just compete for the good stuff. Because, I've seen properties on main roads get competitive in a hot market, but in a slow market, nobody will touch them. If it's right on a train line or backing onto shops, the rear lane backs onto shops and there's restaurants with food bins and stuff like that, or sitting in flood-prone zones, or we often talk about the house next to a service station. I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that are just absolute red flags. So even within the same suburb, micro factors like the elevation or overland flow can make or break future value. Could be a super steep block. Nobody loves the steep blocks. Could be a flat block, but it's at the bottom of the gully and it floods, right? So knowing these details before you buy can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars down the track.
And we've got to go back to that depends too, because that really steep block, and it's probably not going to be for a first time, but if that is on the top of a ridge and it's got a full uninterrupted city view, that could be really, really valuable. And those people might have the funds that would allow them to actually do a really good renovation on that block. So again, it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. You've got to look at all of the factors when you're looking at these things. And we have checklists for those things so that people know what to look at. And that kind of flows into the 7 fundamentals that you need to assess when you're looking at any property. This isn't a home buying checklist, right? This is not our inspection checklist. That's a totally different process or a checklist downloadable that we've got in the course. But no matter where you're buying, these 7 factors are what you really want to look at and will help you understand whether a property is investment grade or investment stock or just a total red flag, don't go there.
So location is the first thing. A lot of people, they get fixated on location and think, oh, I want to buy the next hotspot. In reality, location is scary. It's a little bit of a red herring, right? So do not focus on, when I say location, don't be thinking, oh, okay, the next place to go off, because that's very short-term thinking. We want you thinking long-term about property. So location, we're talking about things like proximity to the things that matter. So it could be schools or cafes or shops or parks or transport, whatever it is that matters to a lot of buyers in that area. Like, that's what we mean by location, rather than trying to pick the next place that's going to go off.
And a few of those points that we touched on before, where is it in the street? Where, what aspect does it have? What's the orientation? These sorts of location questions are important. Transport is really important. Now, you might work from home, but if you're thinking about your future buyer, you do want to have a bit of an idea about where the access routes are, what is the convenience of public transports, how do you get in and out of where other people might consider major employment hubs. So having an eye on that will help you have an investment lens when you're looking, even if you don't plan to use public transport yourself.
Even just the roads. I mean, like, for example, I think of property, a couple of properties come to mind. One was a property we looked at for some clients some years ago. And in this particular section of this suburb, it gets gridlocked on a Saturday. There's like a private school on one side and a private school on the other side. And all the mums and dads are
school sport,
driving the kids around for school sport. And it is gridlock. And so I know when we're doing open houses on a Saturday, we'll give that whole section a wide berth. But this street sat in the middle of the gridlock section. That is absolute local knowledge. That is a beautiful home. These people came to us with the home. They said, look, we found this home. Would you evaluate it for us? And we go, yes, we will. But we want to really talk to you about this and we want you to go there and check at different times. And they're like, oh my God, you can't get in and out. Like, you're waiting for a long time to get in and out. So that's driving in your car. Another one is another house that was on a one-way street. But one end of that one-way street is Parramatta Road. And you can only turn left into the street. You can't turn right. So you've got to go right up, around, do this massive big dogleg loop thing, and then come back onto Parramatta Road and then turn if you're coming from the wrong direction. And it doesn't matter where you are, you can only enter this street from Parramatta Road. It's a pain in the neck. So there's little things like that, you'd be thinking about, and they become irritants, and they're the sorts of things that make certain properties transact and certain streets transact more often because people get sick of living there.
Yeah. And as you say, if you're the person who's doing the right due diligence and going in there at the right time and you can pick these things up and you can avoid that property, it might sell over and over for a few times. And you might think, oh, maybe we should have, but I'll guarantee if you compare that resale value and look at the compounding capital growth over time, each time that resells, if you've done the right work and got the investment fundamentals right, then you should have outperformed that property each time it turns over.
I've tracked sort of certain properties like that keeps up for reasons like that, and you can see them fall further and further away from the rest of the market, actually. So, yeah. And then look, another thing to look at is demographics, right? It's who lives there. And that's partly also income. Can people who live there, A, want to live there, or they're only living there because they can't afford anything better? And they want to live there, so it's aspirational. Can they afford to buy there? And then obviously you want a certain amount of people that rent. That's a good diversity of an area, but you don't want more people renting than owning. In an ideal world, you're looking at roughly the 70-30. Although some areas will be less than that, very established areas, but like you do want to have a lot of owner-occupiers who want to live in it, in the area, and can afford to live in the area. And you think about who are the people that are able to do that as well. And that's important. So we're looking at socioeconomic scores and things like that do allow an area to retain its value. And that's what's important, obviously, if you're going to invest in an area, whether you're buying for a home or an investment, thinking about these things is really fundamental.
Yeah, household income's one percentage of owner-occupiers to investors. I think it's really important to have a look at those owner-occupiers and what they're paying for properties in the area, because sometimes if you've got a higher household income, that can actually attract more people like that to the area. So areas that are gentrifying, sometimes those sorts of stats lag as if we haven't had a census in any period of time. But you can actually go and just immerse yourself in the community and the neighbourhood and get a feel for who's there, who's at the parks, who's at the pub, who's at the shopping centre is a classic one because everybody has to go shopping, and you'll get an idea of who's in that area and whether it suits you and what that impact that might have on potential for growth for a property. The next one is rentability. Now, very, very important for rent investors, but it's also worth looking at from a personal livability point of view as well. And it's the layout. Does it flow? Has it got a good functional access relative bedrooms to bathrooms to living areas, outdoor areas? What's the livability like? You're looking at that from an owner-occupier point of view, but you're also importantly looking at it from a renter's point of view.
And then we like to look at potential. You don't always have to buy a property, but if there are often opportunities to accelerate, do a sort of a one-off acceleration of value if the property can be improved or extended. And so with a judiciously planned improvement can be quite successful. And it's something that we do tend to look at too. Is there a potential upside with the property?
And it might not be that you do it. In Queensland, our houses are often built on stumps and they might be head height or they might be a little bit higher. But to double your size, rather than building on top, we raise the house. So the house goes up to more than 2.4 metres, and then you can build another level underneath, put in an internal set of stairs. Now, if a property has already been raised to legal height, it's commonly referred to, that is really positive. Now, you might not be the owner that does that work, but when you go to sell it, there's that potential for that next person to say, oh, this is already raised to that height. I can actually dream about putting those extra bedrooms and living area or whatever the case may be. So you might not do the thing that has the potential, but it will be potentially valuable to the next person who might do it.
Just on that, in the news this week, I noticed in Brisbane, I can't remember which suburb, it was at West End, the house that had been raised in the process of being renovated, but a big storm came and basically knocked it off its footings, and the poor people lost their whole house.
Stumped. Yeah. It was very elevated position, but that was, so we had Cyclone Alfred in February, March. For this part of Brisbane was a little bit of a fizzer. I know it was very hard hit in other areas of the state, but the winds, particularly whipping through from the west through the CBD, far in excess of what we experienced then. It was very short but very wild, and that house unfortunately came off the stacks that it was on and sort of tumbled down a little bit. Luckily stayed within its own yard, so it didn't affect other houses around it, but it, just absolutely heartbreaking for those people.
The sixth thing, talking about 7 sort of key areas here, and I stole the thunder of the 7th one, I realised, because I added to it one earlier, but the 6th key area is supply. And that is really how much competing stock is nearby. We talk about this all the time. Scarcity, supply. We talk about, when you're buying a new subdivision and you think, okay, well, how many new suburbs can be added on and how much competition will there be for years and years and years to come? So supply is very, very important. It's a very important concept. And so we go for that scarcity. We go for limited supply because that is really what's going to shore up your future capital growth. And so that's the important investment fundamental.
You often hear in marketing hype that it's a growth corridor or so much positive development going on. You got to have a look at what that development is, because if it's all more of the same, then all you're doing is adding to supply, not necessarily adding to demand. So be really careful about those words. Growth corridor can often mean growth in number of properties, not growth in property value. So just dig down, make sure you learn what those things mean and what's important from a potential for capital growth perspective.
Yeah, it's so important that, because developers love that term, growth corridor, and it's like, it's growing their coffers. It isn't growing the coffers of the people who buy that property usually. And the other thing that they will use sometimes on that same theme is they'll talk about this area's got the highest median growth rate. And because they are saying it's not technically a lie, because when all the people that had the market gardens or whatever it is that they sold to create this whole housing estate, well, when they sold that, they had a huge windfall when they sold that property, which is basically reflected as capital growth. So technically it's correct, but the next person isn't going to experience that because they're only buying a fraction of what was sold in the first place. So you've got to be very careful about that supply and those claims of growth. The seventh one that I sort of jumped in ahead before was it's affordability. So, I talked about, do locals earn enough to rent or buy similar homes, and do they want to be there, the aspirational side of things. But the flip side of affordability is a lot of investors go for affordable markets. So this is the thing you have to be really careful about. Not going for aspirational, not for affordable. If you're going for affordable, you often are going for a demographic that will pay higher yields because they can't afford to buy, so they can only rent. And so you have to be very careful about that. So affordability is a bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to a fundamental of investing, but understanding what it really means and the consequences of that is really important.
Yeah. I guess if we layer on top of that if it seems cheap and everything seems cheap in the area and people are only wanting to upgrade out of that area, they're not wanting to upgrade into that area, then you're only ever going to be selling to people like you who might be first home buyers or first time investors. And that's not necessarily going to be a great driver for growth.
So if you get all these fundamentals right, you will drastically reduce the risk of buying a dud. But there's another very big thing that really you need to be thinking about if you've got your investor hat on, and that is, do not buy for tax reasons. Right? Now, we're obviously not accountants. Some accountants may say to their clients, you're paying too much tax. If you go and buy a property that you can negative gear, you're going to get some tax back. But the reality is you have to lose money in order to get your tax return, right? So depreciation and negative gearing might sound enticing, but they are absolutely not a reason to buy. They're like icing on the cake. If you're only investing to save tax, you're really missing the point. New builds often offer great deductions, but poor capital growth, right? So you've got to focus on making money, not saving it. And tax benefits should be the bonus or the icing on the cake, as I said, not the foundation of your strategy. And the flip side is actually there's some good tax incentives for buying your own home because you don't actually have to pay any capital gains tax when you sell it, assuming that you've always lived in it since you bought it. So there are actually some tax incentives for owning your own home and living in your own home.
Yeah. Now, of course, what Veronica has been talking about there largely relates to rent vesting or buying investment property, not to your principal place of residence, because of course you can't appreciate or negatively gear the home that you're living in because it's not an income producing asset. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But let's talk about rent vesting. If you are rent vesting, don't do it yourself on the property management. Now, I've been in property management. I've had a rent roll for 17 years. And Veronica, you are now in property management. It is hard to keep up with the legislation, the changes, everything that you need to do properly in property management. And if you get it wrong, the implications can be quite significant.
Yeah, look, it's a minefield. And I didn't even want to get into this business until I had the right business partner who has experience. So I've been in the property space, but I still didn't see myself as doing it because a really good property manager is going to handle tenant screening, maintenance, compliance, rent reviews, calls in the middle of the night that the hot water system is just blown up. There's the sorts of things that a property manager handles. A lot of them will also do those inspections to make sure that, you are aware of what needs to be maintained, but the tenants are doing the right thing. It will absolutely save you from legal headaches and emotional stress. It really is about insurance, effectively, for your asset. It's very, very important you get a professional who really knows what they're doing, is very proactive. But don't try to do it yourself. It's a false economy.
Strata and building management really matter as well, Veronica. If you're not buying a freehold or a Torrens title property, apartment buyers, townhouse buyers, villas, a really good strata manager can make or break your investment or your livability in the property, to be honest. You can't choose them, but you can choose the building you buy into. So look for complexes with good record keeping, transparent. They're prepared to show and share everything. And importantly, a really healthy sinking fund or capital works fund.
And harmonious as well. You want a good culture in the place. A strong owners corporation really protects your investment long term. So you go, owners corporation is made up of all the people that own in the building. Then you've got an executive committee, which is made of volunteers effectively that are voted into roles. And then you've got a strata manager that reports to them effectively. So all of those layers are really, really important to have right. And you need to be able to assess a building as to, well, how well run is this? And if it's well run, it makes your life a hell of a lot easier. Also, it does contribute to the ongoing value of the property and increase value in cases as well, because well-run buildings are much more desirable to buy into.
Absolutely. You can see at the moment you walk into it, if the leaves have gathered in all of the corners and the plants are overgrown and the pathways haven't been gurneyed since it was built, you're looking at, okay, someone's not taking care of this complex. And where is the problem? Is it the body corporate manager, or is it actually the owners corporation who are not agreeing to pay the money that needs to be paid? And that can happen where you've got a lot of investors versus owner-occupiers, which is important to work out that balance. Now, and
that's funny, isn't it? That's ironic again, because the investors are actually causing more problems. So again, another reason to think like an owner-occupier when you're investing.
Yes. All right. So the true cost of ownership is another thing that you really need to consider. And as an investor, the holding costs can come up to about 20 to 25% of rental income.
So I think it's gone up, like it used to be 25. I was listening to a podcast with Stuart Williams a while ago. He reckons it's up to 30 to 35 now. So it was commonly accepted around 25, but I'm just thinking now, maybe we need to be suggesting budget for a bit more.
Yeah, it's better to budget for it and not need it than to have a surprise that you weren't expecting. Well, now, of course, owner-occupiers won't have the property management component, but you've still got insurance, maintenance, rates, compliance, all those things that you don't expect to come up when a hot water system goes. These sorts of things, the true cost of owning a property, you really need to wrap your head around.
And that's really why it's so important that your property grows in value. It doesn't just break. Capital growth, as we mentioned earlier, is what really gives you real options later as time goes on. It does cost money to hold a property. So whether you're living in it or whether you're renting it, I often say to investors the first 10 years of owning your investment property is probably the most painful, because the growth just seems insignificant. It's only 10 years you go, wow, that has compounded. I can really see it now. But when you're in the middle of it, it just seems so slow. And yet the monthly cash flow, the outgoings, they never seem to let up. A lot of people suffer from the stress of that, and they end up bailing out of the property too early in some cases. But it is important to understand this, because you need to weather this storm and to weather that sort of income. But if you bought a good asset, if you really focus on the fundamentals and bought a really good investment grade property, then you can take comfort in that it's doing the heavy lifting for you. It's doing the hard job of growing in value whilst all this sort of pain is happening in the short term. So owning property can be incredibly rewarding. I look back now, we're both old enough to have had many decades since we bought our first property, and we can look back now and see how that has set us up. Those properties set us up for where we are today. We never would have got where we are today had we not started and started well. And we're going to revise one of our old episodes about all the lessons we learned in our first home buyer journey as well, because the reality is we didn't get it all right, but we didn't get it all wrong either. So you can get it all wrong. You can get a lot more right than we did.
Well, that's the aim of this, isn't it? To share what we've learned so that other people don't make the mistakes that we make, but also don't make the mistakes that their friends and colleagues might be making.
It's easy to make mistakes, right? And actually, it's easy to do it right as well. And I say easy, you just have to do a bit of work, but it can be achieved. You can do very well. So I think whether you're buying your first home to live in or to rent out, each purchase really needs to be investment grade, right? So understanding what drives demand, how to avoid red flags, and always keep your sort of eye on the long game. That is really going to help set yourself up for future success.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, knowledge is your best investment here. You'll find everything you need to buy with confidence if you jump on in and do the first home buyer course. I know that it feels like we're constantly telling you, because we are constantly telling you, if you do all the steps in the right order, you will buy better and you will avoid the mistakes that other people might make.
I was asked again last night, I was on Martin Knowles' show, and there was questions that come up, and how can I find independent advice, because everywhere I turn it just seems like somebody's trying to sell me something. Well, we're only trying to sell you a course, and in that course is independent advice, and it's good advice, because I still haven't seen anything out there like what we provide, and because we are property experts and we're giving you insights into that expertise that we've built up of many decades buying for clients professionally. So take advantage of it, please. Take advantage of us.
Too many first home buyers are stressing themselves out and wasting money just by doing things in the wrong order. That's why we created the First Home Buyer course, a 10-module online course with weekly mentoring, where you'll learn exactly what to do and what not to do at every stage.
So instead of drowning in Google searches and random advice, you'll feel clear, you'll feel confident, and you'll feel in control. You'll get direct access to us so you can send through properties you're considering, and we'll tell you if they're worth it. And we'll even help guide you through negotiations.
The course is $990, and honestly, it'll pay for itself, because buying without the right guidance can cost you tens of thousands more than the course itself.
Quick note, you of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording, but things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to join our Facebook group. It's called Your First Home Buyer Guide Australia, and it's your opportunity to connect with us and ask us your questions, which we will answer, meaning you can make sure that you're not getting led down the garden path. We hope to see you there soon.